Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and for joining us for this conversation about challenging governance through punishment and the politics of solidarity, which we'll say something about in a moment. And a real thanks to Haymarket Books and to Sean and John for making this happen and for hosting us. We really appreciate it. My name is Cameron Rasmussen. I'm one of the folks in the Justice Beyond Punishment Collaborative. I'm also on faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm going to introduce my colleague and friend, Charlene Allen, in just a moment, but just to say how this event is going to go. We're going to do a little bit of framing about the conversation we're going to have. We'll introduce our three incredible panelists, and we're going to have two sets of conversations, one about punishment, one about solidarity and their intersections, and then we'll make time for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Charlene Allen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Cam. As Cam sort of said briefly, the two of us, as well as Laura and Nadia, who you'll meet on our panel, have been part of the Justice Beyond Punishment Collaborative for, I guess, 4 years now, which is just a group of folks and representing organizations in New York City who are trying to look at punishment as the central theme that it is, and so much, and talk about how do we talk about it, how do we think about it, how do we act differently around it, so that we can ultimately change its use, its centrality as a state weapon, right? As a weapon of the state, as it has been for so long in our country. And so this webinar is just kind of part of that conversation as our collaborative actually winds down and we start to think about sort of what is next in this world in which punishment is becoming more and more of a central theme of government and of the state each and every day. So what's going to happen now is Cam and I are just going to do a little bit of framing of the conversation that we're going to have today, and then we're going to get right into it with our amazing panelists. So one aim of today's conversation is to think together about how state punishment is being used in this particular moment, and to consider if and how it is different than it has been historically, because it's not new, right? But how is it maybe different, so that we can use that information to better organize, to better fight it. Two quick thoughts I want to share to kick us off under that umbrella of what's the same and what's different is, one, we know that the Trump administration has not come up with this idea of state punishment, right? It's been well established. It has been broadly accepted in this country for a really long time. That's how we get to be the leaders in mass incarceration. So with all that is happening now under this administration, it's building on a strong foundation based, as we know, historically, largely, but never exclusively, in the incarceration of Black men. And then two, one thing that seems new and different right now, at least different for this generation, is this flagrant and public celebration that now surrounds punishment. I'm sure y'all know what I mean. It's become commonplace to hear leaders glorying in deporting families, in prosecuting their enemies, in labeling dissent as punishable by death, right? And we see the memes and the images basically depicting these sort of raised arms of victory as these punishments are brought down. And many of us know, for people who like to think about, what happens in authoritarian governments, we know that this kind of public joy in humiliation and pain is a huge red flag of authoritarianism. So one question that we're posing today is, how do we address both the old and the new as we face these current threats to so many of our communities in this country and abroad? So that's one point. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Cam for the next point of our frame.
Yeah, just a little bit more on the framing. I mean, on the punishment side of things, the infrastructure for state punishment is as big as it's ever been. And, since October 7th, the level of repression against organizing for Palestine, certainly under the Biden administration, and now under Trump, that repression was already beyond Palestine, but has sort of exponentially expanded to target a whole host of movements and groups and communities. And so, you have a rise in repression, you have a rise in authoritarianism, and an infrastructure of punishment that already existed that is there to be leveraged. And now ICE is the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country. And so we have a set of circumstances that are quite difficult. And the next set of questions or topics and questions that we're going to talk about is this issue of solidarity. And it's my sense that there's a little bit of this might not be the right language, so I encourage you to sort of push back on this, but a bit of a paradox about solidarity in that we need more solidarity than we've ever needed before. Like the threats against all sorts of communities are higher than they've been, and the risk in sort of acting in solidarity is higher than it's ever been. And I welcome you to push back on this term risk, because I don't want that to be the term that I use, but that's sort of where I'm at this moment. And so the question is, how are we, if we take that sort of and we agree with that, how are we understanding solidarity in this moment? Is there anything you can offer all of us in thinking through this idea of solidarity? And then we'll also have some time to think about the actual practices and examples of solidarity. So that's a bit about our framing. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists. I'm hoping that the bios can be added into the chat for the event so folks can read them if they want. I'm going to start with Laura. I'm looking at Laura. Laura Whitehorn is many things. She's a friend, a colleague, and a mentor. And I met Laura through our beloved friend, Kathy Boudin, and their work starting the Release Aging People in Prison campaign. And Laura has been fighting against imperialism and prisons and oppression for many, many decades. And we're really grateful that you're here and for all the work and for the way that you continue to show us how to be and how to show up. So thank you for being here, Laura. Next, I'm looking at you, Silky. Silky, thank you so much for being here. Silky, I also met through Kathy Boudin. So Kathy is a through line. And in fact, there's a link between Nadia and I also. So Kathy is with us. I met Silky through organizing Beyond the Bars with Kathy. And Silky is the executive director of the Detention Watch Network and the author of Unbuilt Walls, and a force in trying to stop the repression of detention and attacks on immigrants. So thank you for being here. And last but not least is Nadia Ben Youssef, who is also many things, is the daughter of immigrants and anti-colonial revolutionaries from Tunisia and people fighting fascism in Spain. And she is the advocacy director at the Center for Constitutional Rights. And she co-founded or founded the Adala Justice Project, which has been central in building solidarity around Palestine and other groups and movements in the United States. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to get us started with our first question. And Silky, I'm going to have you go first. So in your own work, how are you understanding punishment at this moment? And how is this recent period a continuation of the past? And how, if at all, is it different? So I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Cameron. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you. I'm such a fan of everyone here and the work that all of you do. And I think in this moment when it's like punishment is taking over in this way and criminalization is like actually a lot of the left is kind of falling into criminalization frameworks when it comes to immigration. Like this is the kind of space we sort of desperately need. So really honored to be here. You know, I think one of the things when thinking about what is, the same, what is sort of different about this moment, the term fascism is used a lot, and that actually like both can be useful, but also complicates things because it takes away from what's a continuation, what's the jumping of scale, what is, what actually has been happening for a long time. And so much of what is happening is just like growth of things that have been happening for very, very many years. And then there are things that are different, that are a departure that we really need to think about. And so when we look at what's the same, I mean, since the 1980s, when we saw the growth of mass incarceration and the prison boom, immigration detention also started to grow. And since then, it's sort of been an exponential rise. And the only time we started to see it really start to shrink was early in the pandemic, and also because a lot of campaigns were being won against immigration detention with this like conjunctural moment around, the pandemic happening, many years of Trump, and also the uprisings for Black Lives in 2020, we actually started to see a shrink, and now it's going up and up. Currently, 65,000 people are in detention, the highest number it's ever been at any given time. They are their expansion plans hope to get it to close to 120,000 people in detention at any given time, which is what the number of people in internment camps and incarceration camps during World War II, Japanese Americans in those camps, like that was the sort of number of people who were incarcerated then. And so I think that, just sort of signals the times that we're in. We see an increase in prosecution of migrants. This has also been happening for many, many years, and at the border, but also in the interior, where people are then being, it's not only that they're going through a civil detention proceeding, but they're um, in jail or prison, serving a sentence for immigration crimes, and then in detention. So there's this double punishment, and then they're being deported. So these sort of like layers of punishment that have existed for a long time, like continue more and more. I mean, money, there's so much money being funneled into it. I think everyone saw this summer with the mega bill that passed $170 billion for immigration enforcement over the next 4 years. Hard to really grasp. The detention budget itself is 13 times what it was previously, which is just wild to think in terms of that amount, and what can be done with that. But that, infrastructure is so key here. I think a lot of times there's this terrain in which we work where we're approaching it from, okay, how do we, combat this in the courts? How do we do work to like change law and policy? But when you have this infrastructure, they are going to find ways to find more people to put into these facilities and these prisons. Creeping into other agencies, we've seen this also in the past, the use of Bureau of Prisons facilities. It's happening more for detention, the use of, military bases, county jails. I mean, that is just like how immigration detention has operated for decades. In working with sheriffs, all that's the same, and all of it's just happening at a really exponential scale in a way that, for me, somebody who's been working against the system for 20 plus years and working on it during the George W. Bush era, when, we started to see the sort of detention boom at the border in Texas, it's beyond my imagination, actually, to see the scale of what's happening and how many more people are dying in detention, like high numbers of people now dying in detention, also just conditions deteriorating in ways that is really hard to wrap my head around. I think the other thing to name here, so as we think about the differences, before a lot of it, and a lot of what I argue in my book, Unbuild Walls, is that the use of the criminal legal system actually allowed deportations to go up. But that's what sort of like precipitated deportations rising in that sort of intersection. And it was a lot in the shadows, and it was like, quote unquote, justified from these frameworks around the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. This is really what we saw in the Obama era, that kind of created the conditions that, gave more rise to the idea of the quote unquote bad immigrant. But it was in the shadows and people weren't seeing it. One of the big differences I think about this time is that so much of it is about the spectacle. So much of it is about the sort of like performance of punishment, the performance of dehumanizing people. Obviously, I think everybody has been witnessing this all across the country in terms of the role of the National Guard and ICE raids and Border Patrol raids in many, many cities, today, right now, as we speak. In New Orleans, a major raid is happening. But also there's also this performance of governors. Like, one of the things that's happening that hasn't happened often in the past is the use of state prisons, and governors actually trying to work with the Trump administration to have these sites of punishment that have become sort of, this alliterative performance. So I think everyone has heard of the Everglades detention camp, which has been called Alligator Alcatraz. But it goes beyond that. In Nebraska, there's quote unquote Cornhusker Clink. In Indiana, it's a Speedway Slammer. And then, of course, in Louisiana Lockup, which is Angola. So again, these sites that are existing prisons that are being used, or spaces that are being created to perform that these governors are actually doing the work to protect the homeland, or whatever other narrative. There's the ASMR videos of deportation flights. So again, so much of it is about like them showing how much they're going after immigrants. And, I think a lot of people will say the cruelty is the point, but there's so much more to it than that. I think there is a real, this idea, I think Nandita Sharma said this, like, threat to the national culture, and like this is their way of kind of going after that, which, you know, again goes to like, when is it fascism, when is it, and I, you know, I think all these things can be sort of argued as fascism, but as we saw with the targeting of international students who were protesting in solidarity with Palestine, expressing solidarity with Palestine, like again, a lot of the things that were happening to them are things that have happened to other immigrants, like, you know, being detained far away from their home, away from their families, not having a warrant, all of these things, having a green card, not necessarily having a criminal conviction. But in these cases, people were being targeted for what are essentially thought crimes, which feels like it's a huge, huge departure. And you know, those were sort of trial balloons. And similarly, the trafficking, essentially state-sponsored trafficking of immigrants to El Salvador, to a mega prison in El Salvador. Again, this is a departure where there was no, like, I mean, people were essentially being disappeared and there wasn't information about what was happening. And again, this is like their idea of going after the sort of enemy from within. So Palestinians, Venezuelans, obviously for many, many years, targeting of Haitians. This week, a rant about Somalis. Like it's really, really a very intentional strategy, which, and just two last points on this, like the thing that I think is really, really, really concerning that is a departure are the third country deportations. Um, and the thing that to point out about this is, you know, people being sent to South Sudan and still incarcerated essentially, to Eswatini, to Ghana, and particularly many, many Black migrants, but also migrants who or immigrants who um, have pretty severe convictions. So that when you look at the press releases that they put out about this, the way they justify it is, and I'm going to quote, barbaric criminal illegal aliens is the language, unquote. Like that's the language that they're using. And they're trying to justify it like these people are deserving. It's like, no, like that, like we have to fight for everyone. And I highly recommend people read a piece by Sarah Stillman in the New Yorker about the third country deportations, really powerful, that actually humanizes people who have past murder convictions. And like, what does it mean to actually tell those full stories? That's so critical. And to me, so much of this is, you know, why this conversation needs to be about solidarity and the history of the PIC and how the prison industrial complex and how it's grown, is that so much of this is based in anti-Black racism. And so when you look at what Trump is signaling, I think one example of how clear that is them saying, we're just going to completely gut the refugee program altogether, but we're going to allow white South Africans, Afrikaners who are being perceived as being oppressed in their homeland into the US. Like, what is that signaling, right? Like, so much of that is like, what does this government stand for? What is this, you know, the sort of like white nationalism, white supremacy is really, really coming through. And so I think to me, those, and, you know, there's so much more to say about what's happened in the last 11 months. Like it's hard to sort of comprehend, but that's kind of where I'll start.
Thank you so much, Silky. It's really rich and also very horrible. And yeah, I mean, the spectacle is, I think, a useful thing for us to think more about. And this thing about the cruelty being the point definitely feels like part of it, but I am interested to think more about what else is the reason why this is happening when there's so many contradictions. Okay, Nadia, over to you. Same question.
Thanks so much, Cam, and thanks, Charlene, for bringing us together. It's really such an honor to be on in a discussion with Laura and Silky and the two of you. That was a masterclass, Silky. I was taking a lot of notes and thinking that you were hitting on so many of the points that I have been thinking about in understanding this moment, and why this sort of the velocity of the opposition and how quickly this is happening, how the scale at which it's happening, and why that feels so significant, such a departure, but also very rooted in this history, the history of this country, the history of US empire, of settler colonialism, and of course, sort of just a history and legacy of anti-Black racism and preserving of white supremacy. Like it really feels like, yes, this is a long story. And, even when we jumped onto this panel, in advance, we were like, just this week, like just the last 2 days, like it really is an endless and very, very quick moving thing. So I, part of what I, might share in terms of the escalation is also trying to situate this a bit historically. I mean, part of what I was excited to talk to you about, Silky, for a long time has been this through line from Guantanamo to Sikut, and the idea that the infrastructure of punishment and the way in which communities are criminalized and then externalized outside of the protection of the law, outside of the protection of the courts, is a story of the last 20 years of the so-called war on terror that I think really we do a disservice to not focus on how that's being recycled and how the infrastructure is being used in this moment, and what we can learn about mass punishment paradigms and mass criminalization paradigms and how those are used to suspend human rights of the enemy, as Silky said, of the other, of those who we've dehumanized so totally that we can take them outside of the realm of human rights, outside of the realm of humanity. And so that's something to share, that there is this through line that I think we should consider, that there is, I think, a sharpening of tools and a narrowing of focus by the opposition on what really has worked. And I think that the security framing, the terrorism framing, is something that I would love for us to think about too, in terms of how the punishment paradigm has escalated, but also just built on this long legacy of like, wow, that's a super successful strategy. If you are designated, defined as a threat, as a threat to national security, as Silky, you were saying, a threat to, frankly, like a world order that's premised on human hierarchy, where certain people have more rights than others, then we're going to designate you, criminalize you, and then find ways to punish in the most severe way. So I think when I look at the why this is happening now, it is to point to what, Silky, you were saying, the sort of growing global consensus over the last decade on injustice, around injustice. So these are uprisings from the Arab Spring to Ferguson to 2020, people really resisting the status quo in such a significant way. And when that happens, there is backlash. At the moments of like profound social progress, consensus about the injustice of the world, those in power who designed that system, who benefit from that system, are going to really sort of crack down. So I think that why makes sense. There's a lot, those who are in power are feeling threatened by the forces of movements, of people's movements. So CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, has sort of can trace its history of the last 60 years of sort of standing in solidarity with those sort of world-changing movements, and representing them, the movements that Laura was a part of and is a part of. What did it mean for people to protect those who were on the front lines, who were demanding a different world? And that gives us a long history of which to understand the tools of the opposition, to sort of silence dissent, to criminalize solidarity, which I'm excited to talk a bit more about. And you're seeing that happen both sort of domestically and then internationally. The domestic piece that I would maybe focus on too is what you shared, Cameron, about sort of heightened repression in this moment of students, of protesters, of civil society writ large, and how the Trump administration is sort of building on sort of a bipartisan repression toolkit, but really sort of escalating that to silence organizing, to try to chill organizing, particularly around Palestine. But as we've seen, it just sort of expands and expands, and it's sort of anyone who again is trying to fight back sort of the powers of the state to cause harm. I'm thinking about the Stop Cop City protests. I'm thinking about certainly the sort of repression against the encampments of students who were protesting the genocide of Palestine. And then now the way that the Trump administration is going through this process of designating or threatening to designate certain groups, particularly for their solidarity with Palestine, as terrorist organizations, designations about Antifa, most recently last week about the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I think there's this way that the Trump administration is using these designations to chill organizing, right? I mean, part of what happens in the framework of designations for terrorism is that it then starts to criminalize advocacy or coordination of advocacy in the United States. So it's a way to stop organizing. And we can get into this in the solidarity piece, particularly what we need to know about solidarity in this moment, why we need to deepen it in particular ways, the risk that you said, Cameron. But I think, that's one piece of the escalation that we're seeing on campuses. And I think it's repression of protests, repression of speech. You're seeing firings of faculty. You're seeing ways that we're just trying to silence these those who are speaking up. And then, maybe I would go back to what Silky, you were saying, sort of on a global level, and the politics of punishment or the governance of punishment of this administration as it relates to the multilateral system, or sort of the way in which countries are working together to move this paradigm forward. So Sikut is a great example. This is the prison in El Salvador, but that was one of 51 countries that the United States was in conversation with about where to send migrants, what to think about sort of these private and prisons and jails and detention centers, and creating sort of bilateral agreements between the United States and these countries to punish migrants, externalize them. And it's this sense too that there's not that much in it for others, save for maybe being saved from punishment, like tariffs or things like this. So I think states are now in a really interesting negotiation around rights, around international law, around norms, given the punishment paradigm that the Trump administration is sort of meting out into the world. I would love to think about that too, because there's the local level, the way that punishment is really being used, and protesters are being cracked down upon. And then there's a broader sort of mega level of how punishment as a sort of diplomatic strategy is really shaking up a human rights framework and sort of eliminating protections for a lot of the most vulnerable people in our communities in the US and around the world.
Thank you so much, Nadia. There's a lot in there. I mean, the one thing I'll pull out, I'm thinking about power and your comments about sort of the escalation in punishment and repression as backlash towards the progress of social movements. And then also the consolidation of power and sort of using everything they can vis-a-vis punishment to extract whatever they want from media, from colleges, from law firms, from all sorts of folks. So thank you for that. Laura, I'm going to turn over to you. Oh, you are muted.
I have to unmute myself. This is a fancy Zoom. I thought someone would do it. Hi, Laura Whitehorn. I am really so honored and feel like I just took a master class from both of you. And I think that one of the important things that just came out of this is the international scope of what's going on and what the performance is for. Because I really agree that this is performative punishment. And of course, what I'm going to say, because this is, you know, people in the Justice Beyond Punishment Collaborative know that this is RAP's analysis, is that the whole point of mass incarceration, which is about destroying Black and brown communities, is to destroy resistance. And that was, mass incarceration was a response to the revolutionary movements of starting way before the 60s and 70s. I mean, Jose Saldana was just reminding us about the role of the Puerto Rican nationalists in the 50s. And the way we see that in New York is that the level of punishment that has been meted out to Black and brown communities it has been invisible to many, including many in the left, and that it's part of the acceptance of punishment as the goal in order to keep us safe. And it reminds me, when in the Palestine movement, the whole question of how Zionism presents itself as not just as safety for Jews, but as that Jews always have an enemy trying to destroy them, that Israel always has enemies trying to destroy it, all manufactured by their attempt to destroy all of the people around them and the people in the world. But that rationale really resonates with people, and it's very frightening to see it exploding on a mass scale. Just to give a little bit of a different framing to this, I want to tell something about that happened in prison. Although I was in prison, I was very fortunate to be in with my dear late comrade Marilyn Buck and a number of Puerto Rican independentistas and other white anti-imperialist women. And because Marilyn Buck was and still is widely recognized as sort of the soul of solidarity with the Black liberation movement, Kwame Ture came to visit her, and he visited all of us too. The prison was afraid to tell him, you're not allowed to cross visit. And it was at the moment when Mumia Abu Jamal was still facing the death penalty. And we were all kind of freaking out. Oh my God, they're going to kill Mumia, kind of. And Kwame said, there is nothing the state can do that the people can't respond to and turn into a victory. There is no defeat that the state can hand out. And the worse, the more performative in that case, to give the death penalty to Mumia Abu Jamal, the more performative it is, although he didn't use that word. I mean, I only learned that word when I got out of prison. The more the oppressed people will lead a struggle to overturn it. So, maybe that gives us sort of a more hopeful view of all this. In New York State, in the prisons right now, we are seeing sort of the gloves, if there ever were any, coming off. And it's exactly what you two said, Silke and Nadia. It's a continuation. It's not different. It's different in one sense, in that because the guards were able to turn the whole question of their brutality on its head and say it was because of the rebelliousness and the failure to follow orders of the incarcerated people, and that's why they had to disobey the Halt Solitary Act, which limited the use of solitary confinement. All of a sudden, it was cheered by many as a tool to keep order in the prisons. And to whatever extent the prisons have been allowed to exist as they are in the United States, the performance we have to look to is the mass media and the television shows and the true crime, and the only answer to pain is to get back is revenge. And to argue against that and to create programs that counter that, we're starting from a community level they're starting with state power. So it's a very uneven battle. But they're just today that came out in the Marshall Project, an investigative report showing the degree of they could call it medical neglect that has killed people in the New York State system. It's not medical neglect, it's medical torture. If you read the descriptions of what has been done to people, it is absolute torture. The murder of Robert Brooks, who died a year ago this week, at the hands of guards, and was only revealed to be at the hands of guards because they didn't realize there were cameras turned on. It was a lynching. It was literally a lynching. And something else that Jose Saldana says that I think is relevant to this is he goes back to the term super predators, when I guess it was Hillary Clinton used that term, some Clinton. And he said that was the kind of the kiss of death for the resilience of mass incarceration, because as soon as you can name a group of people as super predators, it's exactly what you were saying, Silke, about the way that immigrants now get talked about. It's the exact same thing. And I think the only other thing I can say is what's different now, I think, is that the state and the guards and some groups of citizens see this as kind of a reflection of the Trump era. And so it's okay because it fits. It's like the level of acceptance of brutality and cruelty has risen. So things that have been shocking, it's like the fact that it's very hard to get people to pay attention to the fact that genocide is still being carried out in Gaza and in the West Bank, because it's been going on for so long before October 7th, but it's been on television. It's been seen for so long that it's kind of like, oh, yes, I know that's happening. What can we do? It breeds a kind of helplessness in people, but also it inures people to the actual cruelty. And in the New York State system, okay, now they have this article showing all these people who were literally killed by the medical care in the system. But before that, we have studies going back years that one person dies every 3 days in the New York State system at an average age of 57, 58, which is, it's insane. It's not normal treatment. It's not normal healthcare. It's not normal life. It's not any of those things. So I think that those are really what's going on in the New York State system now. And what else has changed, unfortunately, and I think we've seen this before, if we're going to look at cycles of revolution and repression, is that a lot of people who care very deeply about the pain that people are experiencing in the prisons think that we can reform the system to be kinder, to kill fewer people, that if we get more cameras, that there won't be as many beatings, that if we can get more oversight of what's going on, and if we can get more prosecutions. And I think, I can say this now from being 80 and having lived through the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the aftermath of the George Floyd uprisings and everything, that those pretty little reforms end up making the system more impervious to attack. And the way they do that is not just by, as people say, oh yeah, because then you don't read the horror stories. I don't think that's really the issue. I think really the issue is that it disempowers the incarcerated people themselves and the family members, because they can't see it as much, number one, but also because those reforms always tend to divide people into smaller groups to prevent meeting. We saw this in the federal system. Susan, Linda, Susan Rosenberg, Linda Evans, and I were all AIDS educators. We had these great projects in every prison we were in. And once there was more of an AIDS movement and the system saw that we were part of it, they prevented us from meeting in groups of more than 3 without a staff member. Who's going to talk about how do I use drugs safely? How do I get clean needles when there's a staff member? So the whole program became kind of toothless, and the power of our group organizing, and then you have to do it underground, of course. But I would just say that is what we're seeing also the state trying to do, because New York is kind of, in terms of prisons, it is the worst in some ways. It has terrible numbers, terrible data, all that stuff. But they also are very good at public relations. And so they're very good at trying to show that after Attica, there were reforms. After this thing, there were reforms. So I think those are some of the things that are different. And the last thing I'll say is a good thing that I think is different, which is that there's a lot more. I know we'll talk about this when we talk about solidarity, but it is a change. There's more coming together of different groups. There's a lot more attention from everyone to immigration. There's more attention to ways to prevent ICE. I loved it. It was a small victory. People heard that ICE was on Canal Street again and flooded down there and actually stopped ICE from being able to do a raid. I mean, one raid, it's not the biggest thing in the world, but those little victories build a movement. And I think for me, for RAP, the big lesson of this moment is that if we don't convince everyone that it is not little reforms, but is the building of a powerful movement to overturn the system and to undo the racist punishment system, then we will lose, and we don't want to lose, and we're not going to lose. So that's been interesting. Silke, I wish you were here. You would see it, some of the lines between some of the immigration rights movements and the prison movements.
Wow. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, all 3 of you. That was so much information. I have been taking notes sort of madly. I want to move us to our next question. Just a few of the things that sort of stuck out in my mind from what each of you said that are just sort of new ways of phrasing it for me that I want to offer back out to folks. One, referring to people as securities, not a piece that I had heard before, just brings so much together just in that one simple word. This idea of punishment as a diplomatic strategy, again, a new way of thinking, taking that lens out even broader, looking at all of the ways that punishment is central right now. And then I have to repeat your quote, Laura. There is no defeat the state can hand out that the people cannot respond to. And that is the kind of hopeful piece that we obviously want and need to hang on to. And it's also a really good segue to our next question, which is, let's get down to the strategies, the nitty gritty. What do we do? So the question is, what are the kinds of goals and strategies that work, that you are seeing to work to dismantle all of it, right? The old ways, the new forms of punishment, the new paradigms, this mass punishment paradigm that someone referred to. What are the ways, the strategies and goals that you all are seeing? And this time, actually, we'd love to go sort of in reverse order and start with you, Laura, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, I can try. So first of all, I want to give an example of a really important resistance method, which was the history of this use of punishment and the history of the calling people terrorists, calling them, security threats. In my life, that has come a lot through solidarity with the Black liberation struggle prisoners. And starting with back when Geronimo G. Jago was still in prison, Sundiata Acoli, people who got out, I'm very happy to say. And it was a very unpopular, and this is a lesson for us, it was a very unpopular issue outside the revolutionary Black movement and its allies. And the reason was that people said, oh my God, they used armed struggle. Oh my God, they shot a gun. Oh my God, and so anytime we see people being sidelined and not supported as after they're arrested because we don't like what they did or we have questions about their politics. I think there was a WAWAG, that's Writers Against the War in Gaza, town hall of about a month ago. And I remember thinking when they were talking about that problem, and I remember thinking, get the person out of prison and then argue with them about their tactics if you don't like them. But if we allow the state to define what's acceptable, that's really going to kill us. So I think one of the strategies is to support every single person on the left, no matter what we think, even if they're not in our group or they're in another group. We must unite against the state. That seems fairly obvious. Another thing, though, that gives that more sort of a more particular history. When we were trying, we had 5 at that point, BLA prisoners, Black Liberation Army prisoners in New York State prisons. And we were trying to do some kind of a campaign to get them out. And we tried a lot of different things. And we were having a lot of trouble getting support. And Kathy comes into this again because she and I went to the offices of then Michael Ratner, the late Michael Ratner, who was part of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And at that point, oh God, now do you help me with his name? The priest who was the ED right then, met with us and Michael, and we said, we are trying to get these guys out of prison, and they have cases that involve killing cops, and so they are targeted by the cops, and we can't get any support. They immediately signed on to support this campaign, and it was the most important step because once the Center for Constitutional Rights saw, not as lawyers say, hard cases make bad law, but hard cases make big changes in power struggles. That made a big difference. And that was an act of solidarity because there wasn't any money in it for them. It certainly wasn't going to make them popular with the rest of the legal community. So using whatever stature and resources we have. The other thing is that I think a lot of times solidarity happens more in the quiet ways and the going to other people's rallies and not speak. You're not going to speak. You're just going to be there, just another body to count, or going to visit someone who doesn't have visitors and you can get in and his or her family can't. Things like that are harder than signing a petition or standing up for something. I know part of this section is about the higher risk. I think the higher the risk, the more you have to do it. And if they say, like, Palestine action is illegal in Britain, then you put on a T-shirt that says, I am a member of Palestine action. And we've had those situations. And then at different points, I mean, we had after 9/11, we had a group like that we said no separate justice. And we were defending all the Muslim prisoners who were ridiculously accused of terrorism. And it was not big. It was not a big group that came, but it was consistent. The same thing is true of some of the Palestine vigils in neighborhoods that aren't necessarily big places of support for Palestine. And I sometimes think to myself, the harder it is, the more important it is, because that tells me that we're at the juncture of something that is important to the state and also important to us. And the last thing I'll say is this: anyone who works with RAP knows that RAP's form of solidarity from the beginning has been that we insist on no exclusions in any kind of effort to get people out, to get better conditions for people, whatever. No exclusions based on the crime, the nature of the crime, because that is the way the movement has been built for years. And so when I hear reports about people being detained for immigration issues, and people say, and they didn't even have a criminal record. That was, Silky, I think we've talked about this before, the good immigrant, bad immigrant. Support everyone, fight for everyone, and fight as hard as we can for everyone, and not just for the innocent, the ones that are easy to talk to your neighbor about.
All right. Thank you, Laura. I'm just going to repeat the line that stays with me: support every person who is targeted on the left, period. Right there. Nadia.
I wrote that line down too, Charlene, and many of Laura's lines. I think, it's interesting because there's a part of my understanding of this moment where I have said time and again, the authoritarian playbook is really, really clear. It's the most studied social science. They write it out regularly. they do the same things, and that maybe what we need to do is get our people's playbook as clear as we can, right? Like what do we know works? And actually, when I'm listening to Laura, we have that too. We have it too. I don't know that I would say that much, even differently than what Laura offered us in terms of what are the strategies that work to dismantle punishment and punishment culture, because we've been doing it, just maybe on the different scale that Laura was saying, like where you have sort of community clarity and commitment to principles and the way that we do the work, and then you're confronting state power and state violence. And so that's why it feels like we don't have our playbook in order, but we do, right? I think, to Laura's point, CCR would call ourselves movement lawyers or movement advocates, and we think about what it means to stand with those who are most impacted by systems and structures of oppression always, and positioning ourselves there. And that's a Black feminist orientation towards how do we understand what is our obligation and how does social change work, and how do we actually by protecting the most vulnerable, we protect all of us. And so we need to put ourselves there consistently as a movement, as the left, as organizers, as lawyers, as artists, as healers. Like that's where we have to focus. And it goes to Laura's point of not throwing anyone under the bus, but being there for those who are most targeted, most marginalized, with all of our force. And I think if we don't, there's a number of things. One, we don't win. Like we can't win if the most vulnerable among us are not protected and are not living full, dignified, joyful lives. Until that happens, then we have failed ourselves and we have failed our community. So we're not going to win. So it's sort of on that level. But it's also that impunity, or the test balloons that Silky, you've said, that are being deployed and tried and experimented on certain people, the most marginalized people, then create the conditions for those very systems and structures and ideologies to be expanded to encompass all of us. Every one of us can then be sort of absorbed into this framework of the other, the framework of, a political dissident, the framework of someone whoever is in power, whatever autocrat or authoritarian is in power, disagrees with. Like, it's an easy thing then to use because we've allowed it to be used for some of us. If we've allowed the punishment paradigm and regime to be used against some of us, then the opposition just sharpens and sharpens those tools and expands them so that we're all sort of encompassed within it. When we talk about why impunity matter, like why we have to target impunity, if you think about torture, which Laura was talking about, we've been so sensitized or desensitized to torture, I guess, that we saw it happen also on images, not in the same way that we're seeing it 25 years later, but the so-called war on terror was filled with torture and on full display. And then, now fast forward to what we saw in Sekut was just sort of a gleeful, we torture, and it's exactly how we want to behave. It's what's happening in New York State prisons. It's like this idea that we have so dehumanized communities and ourselves in the process that sort of these standards, these absolute prohibitions of norms of humanity are like suspended. And so impunity for torture at any stage creates the conditions where we are able to witness and celebrate the torture of human beings now. And I'll tell a quick story, which is that I was in Geneva this summer at the Human Rights Council, kind of talking about Sekut and talking about the Guantanamo through line and these bilateral agreements. And I was with a comrade, Joey Mogul, amazing movement lawyer in Chicago. And Joey had been with a delegation in 2006 again to the Committee Against Torture in Geneva around the Chicago torture work that was happening, and also with Guantanamo lawyers. And Joey said, in Geneva, there was sort of this shock of what was happening, the shock that torture was happening. There was a lot of condemnation. And so when they came back 20 years later to talk about torture, they assumed that it would be met with the same level of condemnation. And they were waiting for states to be like, we cannot accept that torture is happening. This is, an absolute prohibition. We completely condemn what's happening in Sekut, all of these bilateral agreements. You can't torture migrants. You can't torture people. And there was nothing. There was silence. There was silence at the international level about what we're seeing. And it goes to Laura's point too about what the genocide, what like live stream genocide, Palestine, Sudan, like we're watching the crime of crimes every day. And what that does to our humanity is so profound. And I think if we allow it to happen to anyone, we've really degraded so many of our norms and of our values, and of like to rebuild what we have lost, I think was going to take a huge amount of effort. But we'll talk about solidarity and how we resist. But I do think that impunity matters, and targeting that, because it breeds the conditions that we're in now. I would say two more things. One, Cam, maybe you can speak about this too, but I think a narrative intervention and ways that we can sort of resist this idea of zero-sum safety. And maybe Laura, you spoke to this a little bit too. Like my safety depends on the unsafety of someone else. And this is sort of a narrative that happens in the prison industrial complex, certainly in terms of migration and in terms of sort of global politics of repression, war, etc. That only one of us can be safe. Only one community can be safe. And so I want to think with you all about what it looks like to resist that. And the last thing I would say that I want to also think really, I don't know, seriously about is non-cooperation as a tactic and as a goal, like to not cooperate with these kinds of punishment regimes to the extent possible, right? Like, what does that mean? It might mean narratively to not cooperate with what's happening, the sort of narratives around good and bad, innocence and non-innocence. Like, I think non-cooperation on a rhetorical level. But similarly, you know, when Cam, you also mentioned this, like the other piece of the punishment paradigm or the punishment reality that we're in that's pretty different is the complicity of institutions in the project of punishing, whether students, whether migrants, whether any undesirable other. When you think about the $940 million that law firms committed to the project of sort of combating or weaponizing anti-Semitism to silence protest on Palestine is really remarkable, like the complicity of institutions. So I think non-cooperation also with the punishment of our people really will matter. Like, what will it look like? And what are you willing to give up or to not capitulate? I think in the way that we're seeing happen. So, right, non-cooperation, resisting zero-sum safety, and then standing in solidarity and shoulder to shoulder with those who are being punished.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Over to you, Soki.
I feel like my mind is buzzing from all of what you both have shared. Nadia and Laura, I feel like there's so many connections, which is, why we're having this conversation. And I think I'm craving some more concrete ways to do that solidarity. But as we get to that part of the conversation, I guess what I would say is, in this question, like dismantling, old and new forms, like it's a really tough time to do this work. It is incredibly challenging. We are doing everything we can to block new detention centers, but they're going up before we even know that they're even in the works. Like, these things are just happening much more rapidly, happening in totally different ways than they've happened before. We have had all these different strategies that have worked, and then they've circumvented it. And that's just how the state works, right? Like, that's constantly what we're negotiating. But it's still so critical that we try to block, to like show that we don't believe this should happen. Like, that's actually really, really essential. And, I think I've shared this before, but like for years, we just lost campaigns against detention. Like, working on this starting in 2003, I, like constantly be like, okay, we're trying this, it's not working, but we're just going to keep trying. We're going to keep trying. And then all of a sudden there was this opening because of that sort of conjunctural moment in 2020. And we started winning pretty significantly. And so I think we have to kind of think about our work as the work of that, the like Ella Baker Spade work. Like, this is the moment to just kind of keep doing this, and there will be other openings at some point. And also, how do we create those conditions that when that next opening happens, the possibilities are even greater? And things are so haywire right now that actually is something that we should be thinking about. Like, that is a possibility in the future. I think so. Yeah, these things take time. I think some of the risks around the strategies is that there is so much normalization of, like, whenever you have people being taken to El Salvador or to Panama or to Eswatini, to all these places, like, there is this normalization of what detention, traditional detention, quote unquote, traditional detention has been, which is private prisons and county jails and federal facilities, and all of that, I think, makes it like we've even kind of experienced this where people are like, well, maybe we want to have detention here so people aren't at risk of being transferred elsewhere. And it's like, no, actually, like when you look at what recently happened in Chicago around Operation Midway, like, I mean, first of all, absolutely incredible organizing to stop the scale of what they were trying to do, what ICE was trying to do there, and the National Guard and everything happening there. But also, say you had a 1,000-bed detention center in Illinois, like Illinois doesn't have any detention. If you had a 1,000-bed detention center in Illinois, which they tried to build for many, many years unsuccessfully because of the work that happened there, it would have been so much easier for them to detain and bring in more and more people and transfer them to other parts of the country. Like it would have just been easier. And I think we have to not retreat because the conditions are changing. We have to stay true to, yeah, like, I mean, it's kind of unbelievable. And I think, we can talk about this more. I mean, I really do think this thread around just like the divisions and how much the divisions are so intentional, and people not like that political education is so critical right now for people to understand the history of these systems. So again, it's like, this isn't just like this new thing that's happening. Everyone's like, oh my God, detention. It's like, no, like this has been happening for a very long time. And so I think that work, like we really need to like not accept the normalization and don't fall back just because the conditions have changed. To me, those are like the very critical approaches. And I'll leave it there since I know we have more questions.
Thank you all so much. Time is flying, and I feel like this conversation could go on a lot longer. I mean, the one thing that's sitting with me in listening to the three of you talk is the level of acceptability of punishment has been pretty expansive, in part because of anti-Black racism, in part because the infrastructure, in part because, I don't know, shows like Law and Order, like entrench ideas of what people think safety means and what revenge, I don't know, that revenge is a good thing. And anyways, I think we're up against a massive infrastructure, and we're also up against sort of helping people unlearn punishment as a effective or right way to respond to violence. And we sort of have to do both. So with that, I'm going to turn us to our last set of questions, and we only have 20 minutes left. So I think I'm going to smash these questions into one. And we may have time for questions from the audience at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll see if we get to them. But the set of questions is around solidarity. And earlier I framed this as sort of needing more solidarity than ever before, but also coming with more risk. And Laura, I take your point that the harder it is, the more important it is. And I think people are dealing with, hard choices on the ground, and the more guidance they can get from all of us, the better. The more guidance I can get from all of you, the better. And so the questions are twofold. One, is there any thinking about solidarity that you can offer in this moment that you think helps us frame solidarity for ourselves in ways that are generative? And two, if you have concrete examples that might help others. I mean, Nadia and I were just in Vieques, Puerto Rico, learning about the history of getting the Navy out of Vieques. And a colleague and friend of ours was with us, and she was sort of saying, like, these stories are not so known. And in knowing those stories, we all become more powerful. And so these kinds of stories that often, to your point, Laura, are not so visible are important to be visible because we learn from them, and we're then sort of inspired to maybe do similar things ourselves. So I can't remember who's going first. Let me see. Nadia, we have you going first, if that's okay.
I was going to jump in with a quick
Oh, yes. Sorry, Charlene.
that. Sorry, I lost my connection for a minute, and so missed some, I'm sure, brilliance. I just wanted to sort of add to that last sort of pull it all together question that you put. Like, I feel like in this moment, part of what's happening around the punishment, right, is that we are all literally being incentivized to throw each other under the bus. Like in all the ways, like the little ways, like, just take your pronouns off of your, your profile picture on Zoom, and then you can get funding, or just use this language, or just, so many ways that we're being, literally begged and incentivized to do that. In light of that, because of that, how do we build solidarity? I just want to add that little piece to it. Nadia, go.
I love that little piece, Charlene, in part because like I really think that this is the issue. It's to what Laura said. The reason, you're doing something right when the empire is trembling and really upset and trying to really create divisions between people, incentivize, as you say, sort of throwing away certain communities or certain issues, right? Like there is the whole, I'm starting to understand that what is happening and what has always happened in these sort of in the toolkit of the opposition is to criminalize solidarity. Like it's really what is the root of what is happening. Even when you look at the terrorism designations and the terrorism framework, CCR and Palestine Legal wrote a report a couple of years ago, building on the research of Professor Darrell Lee, that found that, the first mention of terrorism in sort of US code was related to support for Palestinian refugees and designating that as sort of material support for terrorism, right? So it's solidarity that's the threat to the status quo, and it's why it's being criminalized in the way that it is. And so when you think about Palestinian human rights organizations that are designated as terrorist or sanctioned for participation in sort of international criminal proceedings, and then any sort of connection or coordinated advocacy with those groups being criminalized, it's really trying to pull apart the threads of what makes us really powerful as a movement, as a global movement, as a movement across communities. So I think, the opposition also thinks that we're really in deep solidarity, which is very, interesting, maybe even deeper than we are, where they're seeing threads and connections and saying like we're all sort of working and organizing together. And so this is the big threat, and we have to make sure that people stop showing up for each other's struggles. And so, I think there's a lot to learn about how the opposition perceives us. And what they find most threatening and what they're trying to silence and criminalize. So that's, I think, what we need to know about solidarity, that it's being criminalized specifically. It is then, I think, our most powerful tool and the most significant thing that we can do, and the most important thing that we can do over and over and over again is to choose each other, see each other in each other's struggle. I mean, to Cameron's point, and we can talk about sort of ways maybe to actionable things or examples. But in the loophole, I think, of this designation framework, where certain groups are designated as terrorists and then you can't coordinate advocacy, I think the lesson for us is to deepen your solidarity so much that it's fully independent, that your advocacy is fully independent, because what happens to migrants is happening to me. What's happening to Palestinians is happening to me. What's happening to Black people in this country is happening to me. What's happening to colonized people and Indigenous folks is my struggle. And so that's what it means to be doing advocacy on the left. Anyway, so I think deep, deep, deep solidarity is the answer. Get so deep that it's yours, that this is your struggle. And then I would say, examples that I've found really extraordinary. In 2016, the Vision for Black Lives, so the Movement for Black Lives issued a vision and had sort of a mention around sort of Palestine and the liberation of Palestine is central to the Black liberation struggle. Lost funding, it was a big disaster, but it was so significant in that moment. And it's why what Laura said, our reality is so different 10 years later about the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the movement for Palestinian freedom, because people showed up for each other and took risks. Suru for Solidarity, I think, is an amazing group that's like, so descendants of those who were interred during World War II, Japanese Americans, who are then turning their attention to the immigration sort of detention regime and resisting it with everything that they have. and showing up in detention sites. And what does it mean to say, like, never again for any of us? And I love that example. I mean, as Cam said, we were just in Vieques in Puerto Rico, in a really intense moment of remilitarization because of this war, imminent war in Venezuela, and what that means for our partners and comrades in the Caribbean. And just showing up. This is the quiet work that Laura was saying, the relationships that we need to build with each other. Show up for each other in the most difficult times. Be there. And I think the relationships that we build then allow us to turn really quickly, to mobilize really quickly when shit gets real, like when it's time to go. We have our bonds, we have our relationships, and it takes time, and these are long pieces. And then I would just, two more things. I would building alternatives beyond the punishment paradigm feels like an exercise that we can do together as movements, as communities. Like, what else can we practice? What other world can we build? And that's where I would end, is like, we have to be as bold as possible. Be as bold as possible. Laura says, like, the system adapts to reform, kind of likes reform because they can just strengthen. If we have a little victory, then they patch it up and make the system stronger. And so be as bold as possible. Don't be afraid of the abolitionist horizon. Like, don't be afraid of demanding the world that we actually need for human dignity to be intact. Because if we have small demands, they will be weaponized against us. If we have civil rights protections that then can be turned around and said, this is reverse racism, or if it's small, not that the civil rights protections are small, but meaning, what are we actually demanding in terms of repair and injustice and accountability and human dignity for all people? We have to be able to and willing to say that, like, put forward the utopian vision and build relationships to get there.
Thank you, Nadia. We just have 10 minutes left. So Laura, I'm going to turn to you and then Silky to bring us home. So each take about 5 minutes.
I'll try to be quick because Nadia said so much. Okay, first of all, I think solidarity is our politics. Solidarity is anti-imperialism. It takes from the world of struggle for self-determination, for the right of return, for human rights, and it says, this is my struggle. This is not something I'm doing for you. This is something I'm doing for me. So one thing I say to people when they say, well, how have you been doing? You're so old. How have you been doing this? It's the best. It is the biggest joy in the world to be in solidarity with people who are struggling and leading and fighting injustice on a level that we have seen, we haven't seen, doesn't matter. But so that's one thing. Another thing, I think learning from the Palestinian movement, and especially our comrades in the Palestinian youth movement, we have to disrupt the systems. Like when they talk about disrupting the supply chain, they're talking about the weapons, but they're also disrupting the
Okay, it looks like we lost Laura for a minute. Do you want to pick up, Silky, and we'll hope to get Laura back?
Yeah, hopefully she'll come back. Okay, well, I can say some stuff and then we can end on her if she's able to come back. I mean, to me, I just feel like, oh, Laura, you're back.
I'm back. Okay. So we have to disrupt the systems that allow this stuff to happen. And in the intellectual systems, like Nadia was saying, the academic lines of achievement in the name of studying things instead of stopping them. And we have to show that it is a joy, and we have to not heroize. I hate the word hero. We have to promote the images. Like Yuri Kochiyama, people know who she was because she tried to resuscitate Malcolm X. She started out in an internment camp. She wrote about it. So these systems that have existed before, and just because I'm afraid I'm going to get cut off again because it says my network configuration is funny. So for rap, when we've many of us in rap have always been in solidarity with Palestine and have been enacting that in our lives. But when after October 7th, when it became a big thing about, oh, don't stay down, we had to talk through with all of our community leaders and people whose lives depend on us getting our initiatives passed and changing the parole board and getting people out and blah, blah, all that stuff. We had to talk through, do we take a public stance? And we decided, yes, we do, because that is what is in our bones and our hearts and our history. And it's important. So we did, there were Zionist funders who weren't funding us anyway, let's be clear, they knew. But it got worse. And so we started doing community outreach events. This shirt was made by someone, I don't even know her, someone who saw rap in action and is an artist and started to produce these shirts, which are now a very popular item in New York City. We had events with Sami Dun, with different Palestinian support organizations. We had a dog show. We had an art show. I mean, people just came forward to do things to replace the funding. So I think, Nadia, that's sort of what you were pointing at about holding each other and being in this together. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that there are examples from the 50s, the 60s, there are examples, and the people in the formerly incarcerated movement, the family members, a lot of them don't know these people. They don't know these examples. And if you don't know the examples, you think you're the first generation, to face this. And so that's why I think we have to show the movies, read the books, give the examples and make it the joy it is. I mean, in prison, I just realized this. In women's prisons, the two biggest rebellions that happened, one in Bedford and one in Lexington, Kentucky, where I was in the federal system, both happened because of the bad treatment that other women were getting. In both cases, Black women, one Haitian, one Black. They weren't cries about our conditions. They were acts of solidarity. And this is from people who had fucking nothing. They were in prison and they risked their safety to act in solidarity with women who were being brutalized. I just think we need to be promoting that and showing people the joy and the fact that that is your humanity. I know that sounds kind of simplistic and stuff, but it really kind of, why else? Why else live if we're not going to fight for one another?
Beautiful. Thank you, Laura. Silky, you could take us home.
Okay, try to follow that. I mean, I've just been so deeply inspired. I think on this thread, thinking about like, to me, so much of it is about just like sowing divisions. There's so much of this that, like, I feel like, Nadia, you talking about, like, when you accept this for some, it just expands to more people. This is what we saw with the good immigrant versus bad immigrant. Now all immigrants are bad in the mind of the federal government, right? Like, that's essentially what's happening. And so we always really have to fight that sort of tendency. And I will say there, like I said earlier, a lot of media outlets and people on the left are continuing to do the thing where they say, well, these people didn't even have criminal convictions. And so, it's so important that we really unpack that. And so much of this work has to be about, like, that political education within ourselves, being equipped to handle those moral panics that happened, like the story of Lake and Riley, or other things, like where things are retreating and moving towards the right. We have to do the work to prepare ourselves. The quick story I'll tell is also on, like, Palestine solidarity, which I feel like I must have told the story before, but several years ago, before October 7th, a few years before October 7th, there was an effort to drop the ADL, and many groups signed on to that effort, including the Detention Watch Network. And it was one of those moments where, like, well, of course we're going to be in solidarity. We were very familiar with the ADL and the harms that they've caused. And ultimately, like, weren't totally prepared for what was going to happen in the context of signing on to that, and how certain members might respond, or the fact that the ADL was trying to get us to remove ourselves from that letter. But it actually created space for us to be much more prepared once October 7th happened, when in fact there were these really, really intense connections around money for Israel and money for, like, more border militarization and terrible policies around asylum. Like, all those things were being packaged together. And our ability to show solidarity in that moment was that much stronger because we had done work prior to that, and were able to be much more public about our position. And so that's it's this muscle that you're exercising. And similarly, when international students were being targeted for expressing solidarity with Palestine, again, a similar moment of, like, we can make these connections, and it's so essential that we make these connections. But we're learning from this experience because we have been doing it for some time. We're exercising that muscle. And I think, I will say, for Detention Watch Network, us becoming an abolitionist organization was really learning from organizations like Critical Resistance, and them doing the work to kind of, like, have those conversations with us. And so much of this is about us working together. And I think anybody will tell you, in any of these instances, this isn't about one population. They are intentionally trying to divide us. So I think everything that's been said, solidarity is absolutely essential. And the last really quick thing I'll say is that so much of the work I've often been trying to do is trying to make the case to people who care about immigrant rights or immigrant justice that, the growth of the prison system, the growth of policing has fundamentally changed immigration enforcement and the deportation machine in the US. Right now, the pathological obsession with mass deportation is changing prisons and policing and the military in the US also. So if we don't fight this, like, on a united front, like, people are going to lose across the board. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. There's so much here, and the conversation I expected it to be a great conversation. It was, I don't know, much more than I thought it would be. So thank you all so much for that. I wish I was as good as moderator as Nadia is, because she would offer a really great summary that I'm just not going to do right now. But I will say thank you and plug a resource. Some of us on this conversation are part of Justice Beyond Punishment Collaborative, and we have a website called beyondpunishment.org, and there's a series of tools on there, including a zine called Freedom for All, which is about not throwing people under the bus when we sort of do our narrative and messaging work. There's a podcast hosted by Kathleen Pequeño called The Problem with Punishment, which is in part about the problem with punishment, but also in part about what folks in New York City are doing instead of punishment. We have a messaging guide called Messaging to Meet the Moment, and then there's some work about a theater piece we did called Stories of Justice and Healing. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I wanted to turn to Charlene for a final word. Oh, Charlene, you're muted. You look like you were saying something important.
Of course I was. I was just saying, good plug on the materials, which are literally a way to kind of get nitty gritty with how to be in solidarity, how to not throw people under the bus. They're just, like, a lot of people put a lot of thought into developing the materials to help us do that. The last thing I'll say for all of us here is my big takeaway, I think, from everything that everybody said, is be visible and vocal in our support of each other and our support of everybody who is marginalized and otherized and deemed punishable. Like, keep it visible, keep it vocal, keep it loud. And I so appreciate all of the nuance and information and energy that y'all put into that conversation. Thanks so much. Good work. Bye.
Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.